This goes back to early January, around 5 years ago. My girlfriend Melissa and I rented a cabin with our friends Rodney and Kathleen. We all still lived with our parents at the time, so the idea of having a cabin to ourselves for a holiday getaway seemed perfect. Rodney booked the place, a rustic cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by snowy woods. Melissa and I drove together and arrived around 5 p.m., unpacking and settling in while waiting for Rodney and Kathleen to arrive. The cabin was cozy but basic, with wooden walls, a small fireplace, and enough space for the four of us. It wasn't luxurious, but it seemed perfect for a low-key holiday escape. When we arrived, we noticed it was in a bit of disarray, but nothing major, just some random belongings left behind. We assumed they were from a past guest who hadn't cleaned up properly. There were a few other cabins nearby, but they were spaced far apart, giving the feeling of being tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The quiet surroundings only added to the charm of the trip. About 10 minutes after they arrived, Rodney and Kathleen realized they'd forgotten some key ingredients for dinner and headed back into town to grab them. Melissa and I stayed back to relax in the living room. The snow had picked up outside, and the warm interior felt like the perfect place to unwind. We spent some time talking and watching TV while waiting for them to return. About 20 minutes after Rodney and Kathleen had left for the store, there was a knock at the door. It seemed too soon for them to be back. I got up to check the peephole, but it was either covered or not working. I couldn't see anything through it. Since we'd never used it before, I had no way of knowing which it was. Hesitant, I cracked the door open slightly, keeping the metal latch secured. The man on the porch looked older, probably in his late 60s, with a rugged, weathered appearance that hinted at a redneck vibe. His hands were jammed into his coat pockets, and he glanced around impatiently, clearly irritated. Before I could say anything, he told me we'd better keep it quiet for the night, mentioning how this cabin had been used in the past for wild parties. As he spoke, he waved a handgun in the air, not aiming it, but the message was clear. "Or else," he added before glaring at me. I stayed calm and said, "No problem, sir," before shutting the door. Not a second later, he banged on it again, harder this time. Melissa and I exchanged uneasy glances but decided to ignore him. After a moment, the banging stopped, and we assumed he'd left. When Rodney and Kathleen returned, we told them about the encounter. They hadn't seen anyone suspicious around the property or on the road nearby. They seemed surprised by the man's complaint, but were also uneasy about the fact that he had waved a gun around. Rodney pointed out that the cabin's history of being rented out for wild parties might have made the man overly suspicious. Still, we hadn't made any noise, and with the cabins so far apart, it didn't seem like we could have bothered anyone. Since we had no plans for wild parties, we figured everything would be fine. We shrugged it off and spent the evening playing board games and watching movies, trying to forget about the strange man. As midnight approached, we heard a noise outside. It sounded like something metallic hitting the ground, followed by the distinct crash of glass breaking. We ran to the window and saw the same man from earlier standing near Kathleen's car, a metal baseball bat in one hand. The windshield was smashed, and 2 of the tires were slashed. He was pacing back and forth, looking like he'd completely lost control. Rodney stormed toward the door, furious. Melissa and I tried to stop him, but he flung the door open and confronted the man. Before Rodney could even say a word, the man raised a gun and fired a shot into the air, the crack echoing through the night. Rodney bolted back inside and locked the door, his face pale. More sounds followed, the man hitting the car's body with the bat and shouting incoherently. Then we heard more gunshots, seemingly fired into the air. Just as suddenly as it all started, the noises stopped. We cautiously peeked outside and saw the man disappearing into the woods. We called the police, who arrived shortly after. They searched the area but didn't find him. Later, they told us he wasn't a neighbor or anyone connected to the cabin. They also mentioned that while drifters weren't unheard of in the area, it was unusual to see anyone wandering around in the dead of winter. It was possible he'd been using the empty cabin for shelter before we arrived, or had just passed through. His identity and motives remain unknown. A few years ago in January, I was driving to my friend's house. Well, someone I was keen on anyway, and was hoping tonight would be the night that, well, you get the picture. It was close to 6 p.m. by then, and already well and truly dark where I lived. She lived a few towns away, and I was feeling the exhaustion creep in. Driving in icy, snowy conditions had started to wear on me. I was on a mostly empty stretch of road that connected to the next town. Forest rose steeply on my left, while the right side dropped away into darkness. There were no houses, no buildings, no streetlights, just the edge where asphalt met empty air. As I drove along, my tiredness caught up with me. I don't know what happened exactly, but I must have lost focus for a few seconds. When I came to my senses, my car was sliding on a patch of ice. I panicked, but it was too late. The car skidded off the shoulder and over the edge. When it finally stopped, the back third was hanging over the rocky drop, while the front remained on solid ground. Thankfully, I wasn't hurt, but I was completely stuck. Any movement risked sending the car over the edge. I pulled out my phone to call roadside assistance. They said they'd send a tow truck, but it could be a couple of hours given the weather conditions and my remote location. That wasn't what I wanted to hear. Due to the car's precarious position, meant I couldn't safely wait for help inside it. I hung up feeling more anxious than before. The next 20 minutes felt like forever, as I stood there alone in the dark. Then I noticed headlights in the distance. At first I thought it might be the tow truck arriving impossibly early, but the lights suddenly stopped. The vehicle sat motionless just a ways down the road, its headlights pointed directly at me. It felt unsettling, something about the stillness and isolation getting under my skin. Then I saw a figure walking toward my car from the direction of the stopped vehicle. My stomach dropped, but as he got closer, I could make out what looked like coveralls in the glow of my car's lights. For a moment, I felt relief wash over me. But then he stopped about 50 yards away from my car and just stood there. The snow made it hard to see his face clearly, but he was just watching. After what felt like forever, he gave a small wave, then turned and walked back toward his vehicle. After he walked away, I heard an engine start. The vehicle drove forward slowly until its headlights hit my car straight on. That's when I could finally see it was a tow truck. Its yellow recovery lights were now flashing. Relief flooded through me. The driver got out, circled my car a few times, and crouched down to look at where my back wheels hung over the edge. He didn't speak, just grunted and nodded to himself, and got to work. He then backed up his truck carefully and hooked up the recovery cables to my car. I stood watching as he worked in the cold. When he was done, he got back in his truck and inched forward, like he was testing how secure everything was. The cables pulled tight as he slowly dragged my car back onto the road. He leaned out his window and waved again, and then, instead of unhooking the car, he just kept driving. I stood there in the snow, watching the tow truck disappear into the darkness with my car attached. My hands were trembling as I frantically called back roadside assistance, telling them their driver had just hooked up my car and driven off with it, leaving me stranded out there in the freezing cold. The operator sounded confused. She said she'd check with the driver and call me right back. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. That's when everything went cold. She told me their driver was still 30 minutes away. That night didn't go to plan. It was definitely not the kind of hookup that I had in mind. The police found my car 3 days later, stripped for parts in an abandoned lot 2 counties over. They never caught the guy. It was a cold night in December of 2018, and I was doing my regular shifts as a Grubhub driver. Snow had begun descending earlier in the evening, but it had transformed into a full-blown blizzard by the time I received my final delivery request for the night. The order wasn't far, just a few miles beyond the city limits, but I was already questioning whether I should have just ended my shift for the evening. The streets were hardly visible, and my vehicle's tires weren't precisely ideal for icy conditions. I convinced myself I'd complete this delivery and return home for the night. The navigation system guided me to a narrow, unlit road on the periphery of town, flanked by thick woods on both sides. It was the type of location that felt unnaturally silent, particularly with the dampened sounds of the storm outside. I arrived at what appeared to be the address and pulled into the start of the driveway. It was a small, dilapidated house, concealed behind some untamed bushes. Various lights were on when I arrived, but then someone began switching off the lights inside one by one, finally turning off the porch light. By the time I grabbed the order from the passenger seat, the house was completely dark. I stepped out into the piercing cold, careful not to slip on the ice. I reached the door and knocked. The door swung open at my touch. It mustn't have been locked or even closed properly. I contemplated going inside, but I had heard one too many tall tales of delivery drivers meeting foul fates, so I decided not to. Against my better instincts, I called out, "Hello, Grubhub delivery here." I lingered there for a moment when I heard nothing back. Apprehensive, I dropped the food and called out that their Grubhub delivery was at the front door. Then I heard muffled shouts and a struggle coming from inside. There was a crash, followed by a woman screaming, and more sounds of fighting. A black van pulled up at the end of the driveway, blocking my immediate exit. Through the falling snow, I could see 2 figures quickly getting out, one carrying what looked like a crowbar. My heartbeat accelerated as I jumped into my car, fumbling with my keys and dropping them between the seats. The figures were halfway to my car when I finally grabbed them. Just as one reached for my door handle, I got the engine started. Without thinking, I hit the accelerator, driving forward while turning the wheel hard to angle the car, nearly hitting the side of the garage, then threw it in reverse. My tires spun in the deep snow as I reversed across the lawn, the undercarriage scraping against the curb as I swerved past the van. One of the men slammed his fist against my window just as my wheels caught grip. I shifted into drive and accelerated down the road. I called the police as soon as I was safely away. Later that night, they informed me there had been a home invasion at that address. The customer who placed the order was attacked while waiting for dinner. They never caught who did it.